White. That was the first thing. Blinding. Absolute white. Then the smell. Antiseptic. Potion fumes. Lavender and something sharp and chemical underneath. Hermione blinked against the harsh light. Her head throbbed. A relentless, pounding rhythm behind her eyes. A low, steady hum vibrated through the mattress beneath her. She shifted her weight. Her muscles felt heavy. Like lead. Her right hand moved blindly across the crisp sheets. Seeking. Grasping. Her fingers closed around empty air. A sharp, panicked spike of adrenaline hit her chest. Where was he? She didn't know who he was. She just knew her hand belonged in his. That the space beside her was supposed to be warm. Her breath caught. She closed her eyes tight. The phantom sensation of calloused fingers brushing against her knuckles felt so real it made her chest physically ache. Miss Granger. The voice was calm. Professional. Hermione snapped her eyes open. A healer in lime green robes stood near the doorway. He was checking a parchment attached to a floating clipboard. "You're awake," he noted. Hermione swallowed. Her throat was painfully dry. "Where?" Her voice cracked. She cleared it. Tried again. "Where am I?" "St. Mungo's. 4th floor. Spell damage." She pushed herself up on her elbows. The room spun. She squeezed her eyes shut until the nausea passed. "What happened? You don't remember?" Hermione forced her brain to work. Department of Mysteries. Level 9. The Time Turner Lab. A new prototype. The brass casing. The runes etched into the glass. The way the sand had started to glow a violent, unnatural blue. The prototype, she breathed. It destabilized. The healer nodded. He tapped the parchment with his wand. Shattered. A localized chronological blast. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Granger." Hermione pushed a stray curl behind her ear. Her fingers were trembling. The blast radius. Who else? Only one other person. She waited. The healer didn't volunteer the name. "Who?" she demanded. Her voice was sharper now. More like herself. The panic was receding, replaced by the familiar need for facts. "Mr. Malfoy." The name hit her like a physical blow. Malfoy. Draco Malfoy. The Ministry's external consultant for dangerous magical artifacts. Her colleague. Her rival. The man who had spent the last 6 months making her life miserable with his endless, drawling sarcasm and impossible standards. Is he all right? She hated how small her voice sounded. "He is currently in the next ward. Unconscious, but stable." Hermione let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Good. She wasn't a monster. She didn't want him dead. She just wanted him out of her lab. "Miss Granger." The healer's tone shifted. It became heavier. More serious. "There is a complication." Hermione went still. A complication. The time turner didn't just shatter. It fractured your chronological cores. Both of yours. Hermione's mind raced. Chronological cores. the theoretical anchor that kept a witch or wizard tied to their present timeline. It was a concept from advanced temporal theory, not something that actually happened to living people. That's a theoretical concept, she argued immediately. It hasn't been proven. According to Croker's law of temporal stasis, a core cannot be fractured without completely destroying the physical body. It has now. The healer countered dryly. He moved closer. He handed her a glass of water. She took it. Her left index finger was stained with blue ink. A familiar sight. She took a sip. "Explain," she ordered. "When the blast hit, your magic and Mr. Malfoy's magic instinctively tried to anchor each other. To keep you both from being torn apart by the time displacement." Hermione looked at him. "Our magic. Intertwined." The healer finished. Hermione choked on the water. She coughed, pounding her chest. "Excuse me?" "Your magical cores are currently unstable. They are bleeding chronological energy. If left unchecked, you will begin to slip." "Slip where?" "Out of this time. Out of this reality." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She bit the inside of her cheek. Hard. The sharp sting of copper grounded her. "How do we fix it?" "Resonance checks," the healer said simply. "Daily. Resonance checks. You will need to spend 2 hours every evening in close proximity with Mr. Malfoy, parsing magic between you, stabilizing the anchor." Hermione focused on the white blanket over her knees. 2 hours. Every evening. With Draco Malfoy. "No. Miss Granger. I have to work. I have research. I can't just drop everything to sit in a room with a man who can go 10 minutes without insulting my intelligence. The alternative is ceasing to exist in this timeline." The words hung in the air. Heavy. Final. Hermione pulled her knees to her chest. She hated this. She hated not being in control. For how long? Until the cores stabilize. Weeks. Perhaps months. Months. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyelids. When she did, the flash hit her. It wasn't a memory. It was too sharp. Too visceral. She is standing in a sunlit kitchen. The smell of coffee and rain. She turns. He is there. Draco. But he isn't sneering. He isn't wearing one of his immaculate, terrifyingly expensive suits. He is wearing a soft grey jumper. His hair is loose, falling into his eyes. He is smiling at her. A smile so pure, so full of absolute adoration, it makes her breath catch. He reaches out. His calloused fingers brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "Morning, love." He murmurs. Hermione gasped, her eyes flying open. The hospital wing rushed back into view. The stark white walls. The smell of potion fumes. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her skin felt too hot. What was that? That wasn't real. That couldn't be real. She didn't drink coffee. Malfoy didn't wear jumpers. Malfoy certainly didn't call her love. It was a hallucination. A side effect of the trauma. "Miss Granger, your heart rate just spiked." The healer was looking at his parchment with concern. "I'm fine," She lied quickly. Her voice shook. Just a headache. Rest. The minister has already signed off on your medical leave for the week. The resonance checks will begin on Monday at the ministry. He turned and left the ward. Hermione sat in the silence. She touched her ear. The exact spot where Phantom Malfoy had brushed her hair back. Her skin tingled. She was losing her mind. That was the only logical explanation. The blast had caused neurological damage. Hallucinations. She needed a book. She needed a diagnostic spell. She needed facts. She reached out, trying to summon her wand wandlessly from the bedside table. Nothing happened. Her magic felt sluggish. Distant. The door to the ward swung open. Hermione jumped. Draco Malfoy stood in the doorway. He leaned heavily on a wooden cane, his pale face drawn and rigid. Despite the impeccably tailored black robes, the slight rumple of his collar betrayed how furious he was. Granger. His voice was a slow, deliberate drawl. It cut through the air like a knife. Malfoy. He limped slowly into the room. He stopped at the foot of her bed. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the clipboard floating nearby. I see they've told you the excellent news. His tone was dripping with weaponized sarcasm. Hermione lifted her chin. She fell back into their familiar rhythm. It was a defense mechanism. It was safe. If you mean the fact that my magical core is apparently tied to yours, then yes. Tragic. He deadpanned. He twisted a silver ring on his right index finger. The movement was fast. Restless. I assume you're already drafting a thoroughly researched complaint to the department. I'm reviewing the theoretical literature, she snapped. Because unlike you, I don't just accept a diagnosis without understanding the underlying mechanics. Draco's jaw clenched. It was a small movement. Almost imperceptible. Understand this, Granger. I have absolutely no desire to spend my evenings trapped in a room with you. The feeling is entirely mutual. Good. Good. They held each other's gaze. The air crackled. And then, it happened again. Another flash. They are in the rain. She is laughing. He catches her waist. Pulls her flush against his chest. His mouth hovers over hers. You're impossible. He whispers. His voice is a low, rough rumble. He kisses her. Hermione flinched backward, her back hitting the headboard with a thud. She sucked in a sharp breath. Draco went perfectly still. His grey eyes tracked her movement. They were sharp. Too observant. What is it? He demanded. His voice had lost the drawl. It was suddenly focused. Nothing, Hermione gasped out. She dug her fingernails into her palms. Don't lie to me, Granger. You look like you've seen a ghost. I said it's nothing. She was panicking. The memory the flash was too strong. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his hands on her waist. She looked at his actual hands. They were resting heavily on the handle of his cane. Get out. She whispered. Draco didn't move. He watched her for a long, terrible moment. He looked at her trembling hands. At the way she was shrinking back against the pillows. His hands tightened over the silver grip of his cane. Monday, 6 o'clock. Testing room 3. He said finally. His voice was entirely blank. He turned. He walked out. The rhythmic tap of his cane faded down the corridor. Hermione blinked. The phantom smell of his cologne faded, leaving only the sharp scent of antiseptic and the harsh reality of Draco Malfoy sneering down at her. Testing room 3 was a closet. There was no other word for it. A ministry-approved, magically dampened, utterly suffocating closet. Draco leaned his wooden cane against the edge of the single, pathetic table in the center of the room. It was scarred and burned from decades of incompetent spell testing. He hated the cane. He hated the slight, humiliating drag of his left leg when he walked. Mostly, he hated that Granger had seen it. He twisted the silver ring on his right index finger. Once. Twice. 3 times. The metal was warm against his skin. The air in the room was aggressively cold. It was 6:15. She was late. Hermione Granger was never late. A knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. He ignored it. He was excellent at ignoring things regarding Granger. It was a skill he had honed over the last 6 months of consulting for her department. He checked his silver pocket watch. The ticking echoed loudly in the damp silence. Where was she? The blast had torn through the lab 5 days ago. He had spent 3 of those days unconscious in St. Mungo's, and the other 2 trying to convince the head healer he didn't need the cane. He had failed on both counts. The fact that his magic was currently tethered to hers was a living nightmare. The heavy iron door clicked open. Granger stepped inside. She looked terrible. Her curly hair was pulled back into a severe knot, but half of it had already escaped, framing a face that was entirely too pale. Dark circles bruised the fragile skin under her eyes. She was wearing minister standard robes that looked slightly too big for her. She looked like she was holding herself together by sheer, stubborn willpower. "You're late," Draco said. His voice was a lazy drawl. Perfect. Unbothered. "I had a meeting with the minister," Granger replied sharply. She didn't look at him. She dropped a massive, leather-bound book onto the table. It landed with a heavy, dusty thud. "Fascinating," he deadpanned. "I'm sure he was absolutely thrilled to hear your thoughts on cauldron thickness regulation while our magic bleeds out onto the floor. We were discussing the department's budget for chronological safeguards, actually." She pulled out a chair. The wood scraped harshly against the stone floor. Draco winced internally at the noise. His head was still pounding from the residual effects of the time displacement. "Sit down, Malfoy. We have 2 hours of this." Draco moved slowly. He masked the stiffness in his leg as best he could. He pulled out the opposite chair. The table was ridiculously small. When he sat, his knees were less than an inch from hers. He could smell her. Vanilla, old parchment, and the sharp tang of ozone that always clung to her after a spell went wrong. He forced himself to look at the blank wall over her left shoulder. "The healer said we need physical contact to initiate the resonance," she stated. Her voice was painfully clinical, like she was reading a grocery list. "I'm aware. Just the hands. I wasn't planning on asking for a hug, Granger." She shot him a glare. It lacked its usual fiery heat. She just looked exhausted. She extended her hands across the scarred wood of the table. Palms up. Her left index finger was stained with blue ink. She was trembling. Just slightly. Draco didn't move. He focused on her small, ink-stained hands, knowing exactly how soft her skin was from the blinding white moment when their magic had crashed together and he had desperately reached for her in the dark. He had thought she was gone. The memory twisted something ugly and panicked in his gut. Shoving the feeling down, he reached across the table and covered her hands with his own. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure, crackling magic shot up his arms. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, pressing down on his shoulders. The damp cold vanished, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying warmth. Granger gasped. Her fingers twitched against his palms. She didn't pull away. Right. She breathed. Her voice shook. The resonance is initiated. Brilliant observation. The magic swirled around them. It was a tangible thing. A golden, shimmering thread binding his wrists to hers. It was intimate. It was entirely too intimate. Draco kept his face blank. A perfectly constructed mask of pure, aristocratic boredom. Granger, true to form, immediately tried to intellectualize the terrifying thing that was happening to them. "I've been reading up on Croker's earlier theories," she said. She was talking too fast, the words tumbling over each other. "If you read the department guidelines, Malfoy, you'd know that a chronological displacement requires exact magical symmetry." She was staring fixedly at their joined hands. "Yes, Granger," he drawled, his voice pitched low. "Do read me the textbook definition of an anomaly while we're actively exploding. It's incredibly helpful." Her head snapped up. Her brown eyes locked onto his. "I'm trying to find a solution. You're trying to find a book that tells you why you're terrified." He countered smoothly. "I'm not terrified. Your pulse is currently beating against my thumb at approximately 120 beats a minute. You are terrified." She tried to yank her hands away. Draco didn't let her. His fingers tightened over hers. Not hard enough to hurt. Just enough to keep the connection steady. "Let go." She snapped. "If we break the connection before the hour is up, the backlash will put us both back in St. Mungo's. Sit still." She froze, hating that he was right. Her fingernails dug into the fabric of his sleeves as her only remaining rebellion. The golden magic pulsed. Slow. Rhythmic. Like a shared heartbeat. Draco watched her. She was biting her lower lip. Her eyes were darting around the room, reading invisible calculations in the air. She was so small. He had spent years pretending she was a nuisance. A loud, swatty nuisance who ruined his perfectly quiet days at the ministry. The truth was, she was the only person in the building who actually made him think. Who challenged him. Who didn't treat him like a fragile, reformed Death Eater or a walking vault of galleons. He leaned back slightly in his chair, putting an inch more distance between their chests. The magic flared. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a massive, rolling wave. It hit him directly in the chest. And suddenly, he wasn't in the testing room. He was in a bookshop. It smelled of old paper and rain. He was standing behind Granger. She was laughing. A real, breathless laugh that made his own chest ache. She turned her head. Her lips brushed against his jaw. "I love you," she said. The voice was hers, but the tone was entirely wrong. It was soft, unguarded, completely devoted. Draco blinked. The bookshop vanished. The damp, grey walls of testing room 3 rushed back in. His heart slammed against his ribs. What in Sulisar's name was that? He looked at Granger. She was completely white. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown. Panic radiated from her in absolute waves. "You felt that," she whispered. Draco's jaw clenched. It was a visceral, physical reaction to protect himself. He locked the emotion down before it could reach his eyes. "I felt a magical surge. Your control is slipping, Granger." "That wasn't a surge. You saw it. I know you saw it. I saw nothing. Focus on the anchor." Malfoy, focus on the anchor. He snapped. His voice was too loud, too harsh. Granger flinched. The golden thread between them shimmered dangerously, then finally stabilized. Draco didn't look at her again. He couldn't. If he looked at her, he might do something idiotic. He might ask her if she had seen the bookshop too. He might ask her what it felt like when she laughed like that. He focused on the blank wall. He counted the microscopic cracks in the stone. When the 2 hours were finally up, the golden thread dissolved into ash. Granger stood up instantly. Her wooden chair tipped backward and hit the wall with a loud clatter. She snatched her massive book from the table. She didn't say a single word. She practically ran from the room. Draco sat in the quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He shoved them into his pockets. He grabbed his cane and pushed himself to his feet. His leg burned with a sharp, white-hot pain. He walked out of the room. The corridor was empty, save for one person leaning against the stone wall near the lifts. Pansy Parkinson. She was wearing a sharp, emerald green suit. Her black bob was immaculate. Her nails were painted blood red. She looked him up and down. Her dark eyes missed absolutely nothing. "Well," Pansy drawled, "don't you look a complete state?" Draco ignored her. He started walking toward the lifts. Pansy fell into step beside him. "Your collar is completely wrinkled, darling. And you're flushed. If I didn't know better, I'd say you just had a rather spectacular quickie in a broom cupboard." "Shut up, Pansy." "Was she dreadful? Did she quote ministry safety regulations at you?" "I said shut up." Pansy laughed. It was a sharp, wicked sound that echoed down the hallway. "You're pathetic, Draco." He didn't answer. He kept walking. He ignored her amused stare. He ignored the burning in his leg. Most of all, he ignored the fact that his hand was clenched into a tight fist inside his pocket, desperately trying to stop trembling from the residual, phantom warmth of Hermione Granger's magic. It had been 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hell. Hermione sat in testing room 3, the heavy rain lashing against the enchanted window panes. A bone-deep, terrifying exhaustion that caffeine couldn't touch dragged at her limbs. Glaring at the massive, leather-bound tome in front of her chronological divergence and the neurological mind, she flipped a brittle parchment page. She needed a logical explanation. She needed proof that the flashes were hallucinations. Neurological misfires caused by the trauma of the blast. Because the alternative was impossible. The alternative meant that she was destined to fall completely, hopelessly in love with Draco Malfoy. It was a ridiculous concept. He was arrogant, deeply irritating, and held entirely too much stock in how much his tailored robes cost. He was not the sort of man who fit into her life. He was certainly not the sort of man she would ever allow into her bed. Yet, her traitorous mind kept conjuring him there. She rubbed her temples. A dull headache pulsed stubbornly behind her eyes. The flashes were getting worse. They weren't just visual anymore. They were entirely sensory. Yesterday, in the middle of a departmental meeting about standardizing cauldron bottom thickness, she had suddenly tasted black tea and peppermint. She had felt a heavy wool blanket settling over her shoulders, and heard Malfoy's low voice murmuring something about the cold, his breath ghosting over her ear. She had completely lost her train of thought. She had stood there, looking blankly at the Minister for Magic, while the phantom sensation of Malfoy's lips pressing against her temple short-circuited her brain. It had taken Kingsley clearing his throat loudly to snap her back to reality, her cheeks burning with an inexplicable, mortifying flush. It was madness. She checked her watch. 5:58. He would be here in 2 minutes. She took a deep, shaky breath and forced her eyes back to the textbook. Section 4. Hallucinatory Echoes. That was it. That had to be it. The heavy iron door swung open. Hermione didn't look up. She kept her eyes glued to the page. She traced a line of text with her ink-stained finger, pretending to be utterly engrossed. She heard the rhythmic tap of his cane. He was moving better this week. The limp was less pronounced. He pulled out his chair and sat down. The silence stretched. Heavy and damp. Granger. His voice was a smooth, emotionless drawl. Malfoy, she replied, still not looking up. I'm just finishing this paragraph. Croker's theory on temporal degradation is actually quite relevant to our current situation. I'm sure it's absolutely riveting. She finally looked at him. He was wearing charcoal robes today. His silver ring glinted in the dim light as he rested his hands on the table. His face was an unreadable mask. A perfect, aristocratic blank slate. It infuriated her. He was handling this so well. He was perfectly composed, perfectly detached, while she felt like she was slowly losing her mind. Right, Hermione said briskly. She slammed the heavy book shut. Let's get this over with. She extended her hands across the scarred wood. Palms up. Draco looked at her hands. He hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. Then, he reached across the table. Their fingers brushed. The spark was immediate. It was sharp and hot, completely bypassing the slow build-up of the previous sessions. Hermione stopped breathing. The breath caught in her throat. She couldn't help it. Draco went perfectly still. His grey eyes snapped up to meet hers. Their eyes met over the small expanse of the table. The air crackled with a sudden, overwhelming electric tension. It wasn't the magic. Not entirely. It was the sudden, hyper-awareness of the physical contact. The heat of his skin against hers. The rough calluses on his long fingers. The way his thumb rested just against her pulse point, steady and warm. He was looking at her mouth. Hermione swallowed hard. Her throat felt painfully tight. She wanted to pull away. The logical part of her brain was screaming at her to break the connection, to stand up, to put as much distance between them as the small room allowed. But her hands wouldn't move. They felt heavy, anchored to his by something far more potent than chronological theory. "You're tense," Draco noted quietly. The drawl was gone. "I'm not. Your hands are rigid, Granger. I'm perfectly fine." She lied. Her voice shook entirely too much. Draco's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He just shifted his grip, settling his hands fully over hers to lock the anchor. The golden thread flared into existence between their wrists. The heavy warmth settled over them. The suffocating magic. Hermione closed her eyes. It was easier to endure if she didn't have to look at him. She began to recite the 12 uses of dragon's blood in her head. It was a grounding exercise. A way to tether her mind to cold, hard facts. 1. Oven cleaning. 2. Spot removal. 3. Curing boils. The magic pulsed. Slow and rhythmic. 4. Treating deep cuts. 5. The flash hit her. It didn't ease in. It crashed over her like a tidal wave. She is lying on her back. The sheets are incredibly soft. Silk. The room is dark, lit only by the silver glow of the moon streaming through a large window. She is breathless. Her chest heaving. Malfoy is above her, his body pressing her down into the mattress. He is completely bare. His skin is hot against hers. The contrast between the cool silk sheets and the burning heat of his chest makes her shiver. She reaches up, her fingers tangling in the soft, blonde hair at the nape of his neck. She pulls him closer. She can't get enough of him. He trails a line of open-mouthed kisses down her jaw, lingering at the sensitive spot just below her ear. He bites down. Hard. She arches off the bed. A desperate, broken sound tears from her throat. It is a sound of pure, unadulterated surrender. Mine. He whispers fiercely against her skin. The words vibrate through her collarbone. Say it, Hermione. Tell me you're mine. Hermione gasped. She violently yanked her hands backward. The golden thread snapped. The magical backlash was instantaneous. A shockwave of pure kinetic energy threw her backward. Her chair tipped over. She hit the stone floor hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The heavy tome on the table went flying, crashing against the far wall. Draco was on his feet instantly. Granger. His voice was frantic. The mask was completely gone. He rounded the table in 2 long strides, ignoring the cane entirely. He dropped to his knees beside her. Don't touch me. She shrieked. She scrambled backward, pressing her spine desperately against the cold stone wall. Her heart was hammering wildly against her ribs. She was breathing too fast. She couldn't catch her breath. She could still feel it. The heavy, possessive pressure of his body. The hot, wet slide of his mouth against her neck. It was too much. It was too intimate. Draco froze. His hands were outstretched, hovering just inches from her arms. He looked horrified. Granger, you broke the anchor. You can't break the anchor. Stay away from me. She gasped out. She dug her fingernails into her palms. Hard enough to draw blood. She needed the pain. She needed something real to cut through the terrifying phantom sensations. "You're bleeding chronological energy," Draco said urgently. He moved closer. "Give me your hands." "No." "Hermione, give me your hands right now." He had used her first name. It was the first time he had ever used it. It sounded exactly like it had in the flash. The same low, desperate rumble. Hermione felt a tear slip down her cheek. She dashed it away angrily. According to the department guidelines, she recited hysterically, her voice climbing an octave. A broken anchor requires a 10-minute reset period before reinitiation to prevent magical saturation. Draco stared at her. To hell with the guidelines. "You're trembling. Give me your hands." "I have to go." She grabbed the edge of the table and pulled herself up. Her legs felt like jelly. Draco stood up slowly. He watched her like she was a wild animal about to bolt. "We have 40 minutes left on the clock," he said quietly. "I don't care." "Granger." I'll the healer. I'll tell him the magic destabilized. I can't do this today. I just can't." She didn't look at him. She couldn't look at him. If she looked at him, she would see the bare chest and the dark, possessive eyes from the vision. She would see the man who had whispered her first name into her skin like a prayer. She wasn't strong enough to see that man looking out from Draco Malfoy's cold, guarded face. Snatching her heavy book from the floor, she hugged it to her chest like a shield. She bolted for the door, practically ripping it off its hinges. The heavy iron squealed in protest as it slammed violently against the stone wall. "Granger, wait." She ignored him. Her footsteps echoed wildly against the stone corridor as she ran. Reaching the lifts, she slammed her hand against the brass call button repeatedly. The lift doors opened. She threw herself inside and mashed the button for the atrium. The doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the empty corridor. Hermione slumped against the brass railing. She was shaking violently. She touched her neck, right below her ear. The phantom feeling of his lips against her skin was still burning so brightly it made her eyes water. Draco Malfoy was going to kill someone. Preferably the ministry official who had designed Testing Room 3, but at this point, he wasn't picky. He was pacing. It was an agonizing, slow process that sent sharp jolts of pain shooting up his left leg every time he put his weight on his cane, but he couldn't stand still. It had been 3 days since Granger had broken the anchor. 3 days of pure, undiluted misery. The magical backlash had nearly sent him back to St. Mungo's. He had spent the entire night shivering violently, his core temperature dropping to dangerous levels as his magic desperately searched for the anchor she had violently severed. He hadn't seen her since. She had owled the healers, citing a temporary stabilization failure and requesting a brief suspension of the sessions. The healers had agreed, under the condition that they resume tonight. Draco stopped pacing. He gripped the edge of the scarred wooden table until his knuckles turned white. He was terrified. It was not an emotion he was used to. He was used to anger. He was used to cold, calculating indifference. He was used to the heavy, suffocating weight of his family's legacy. But terror? Raw, visceral terror? That was new. He had seen the way she had looked at him before she fled the room. She hadn't just looked panicked. She had looked utterly broken. He knew she was seeing the future. The healers had explained the theory of chronological echoes, how the mind tried to process the displaced energy by latching onto probabilities. But Draco didn't need a textbook to tell him what was happening. He had felt the surge. He had seen the way her magic had desperately reached for his, seeking comfort, seeking a connection that hadn't been forged yet. And he had seen the bookshop. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the memory, but it was useless. It was burned into the back of his eyelids. Granger, laughing. Granger, soft and unguarded. Granger, looking at him like he was the only man in the world, her lips brushing against his jaw as she whispered those 3 impossible words. I love you. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. He was a Malfoy. A former Death Eater. A man with a dark mark burned into his forearm and a past he could never outrun. Granger was the Golden Girl. The brightest witch of her age. A war hero. They did not belong together. In any timeline. In any universe. The heavy iron door clicked open. Draco turned, his mask of aristocratic boredom snapping into place with practiced ease. Granger walked in. If he had thought she looked terrible 3 days ago, it was nothing compared to now. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was translucent, stretched tight over her cheekbones. Her eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark, bruised circles that spoke of days without sleep. She was trembling. A fine, constant tremor that she couldn't seem to control. She didn't look at him. She walked straight to the small wooden chair and sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Granger, Draco said quietly. I'm ready. She said. Her voice was raspy. Hello. She didn't extend her hands. She kept them locked together, her knuckles white. Draco moved slowly to the opposite chair. He sat down, placing his cane carefully against the table. He looked at her. Really looked at her. She was biting the inside of her cheek. He could see the slight indentation on the side of her mouth. You look like hell, he noted. It wasn't a taunt. It was an observation. Thank you, Malfoy. Your charm is, as always, overwhelming. She didn't rise to the bait. There was no fire in her eyes. No sharp, defensive edge to her tone. Just a crushing, absolute exhaustion. You haven't been sleeping, he pressed. I've been working. You've been hiding. Her brown eyes finally snapped up to meet his. I have been compiling data on chronological stabilization protocols, she snapped, a faint spark of her usual stubbornness returning. Because someone has to actually understand what is happening to us, rather than just blindly accepting a poorly theorized diagnosis. You're terrified. I am analytical. You're shaking, Granger. She looked down at her hands. She unclasped them, pressing them flat against her thighs. Initiate the anchor. She ordered, her voice trembling slightly. Draco didn't move. Not until you tell me what happened 3 days ago. Nothing happened. You broke a magical tether mid-surge. You nearly put us both in the hospital wing. You ran out of here like you were being chased by a basilisk. Tell me what you saw. I didn't see anything. She was lying. She was a terrible liar. Don't lie to me, Draco said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. I'm not lying. The magic was overwhelming. It was too much. You saw the future. It's not the future. She shouted, her control finally snapping. She slammed her hands onto the table. It's a hallucination. It's a neurological misfire caused by trauma. It isn't real, Malfoy. It can't be real. She was panicking again. Her chest was heaving. Draco leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Why can't it be real? He asked softly. The question hung in the air between them. Heavy. Charged. Granger gaped at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, desperate energy. Because it's you. She whispered. The words felt like a physical blow. Draco flinched internally, but he didn't let it show on his face. He kept his expression perfectly blank. How flattering. He drawled. You don't understand, she pleaded, her voice cracking. It doesn't make logical sense. We hate each other. We have always hated each other. You stand for everything I fought against. You. She trailed off, swallowing hard. I what? You look at me with so much. She couldn't say it. She closed her eyes, shaking her head. Initiate the anchor. She repeated, her voice deadened. Draco watched her for a long moment. He wanted to tell her she was right. That they were entirely wrong for each other. That the universe had made a mistake. But he couldn't. Because even now, looking at her pale, terrified face, all he wanted to do was reach across the table and pull her into his arms. He extended his hands. Palms up. Granger hesitated. She looked at his hands like they were coated in poison. Slowly, agonizingly, she reached across the table and placed her hands over his. The connection was instantaneous. The golden thread flared to life, binding their wrists together. The magic was different this time. It wasn't just warm. It was heavy. Suffocating. It pressed down on them like a physical weight, thick with unsaid words and denied emotions. Granger gasped, her fingers digging into his palms. Steady, Draco murmured. He shifted his grip, interlocking his fingers with hers. It was a deeply intimate gesture. He didn't care. He needed to ground her. She didn't pull away. She clung to his hands, her eyes squeezed shut, her breathing shallow and fast. The room was completely silent, save for the ticking of his pocket watch and the erratic sound of her breathing. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The magic pulsed between them, a slow, rhythmic throb that perfectly matched the beating of his own heart. Draco kept his eyes fixed on her face. He watched the way her dark eyelashes fluttered against her pale cheeks. He watched the way she bit her lip, trying to hold back the fear. She was so incredibly brave. He had always known that, of course. He had seen her stand up to Death Eaters. He had seen her survive a war. But this was different. This was a quiet, internal battle, and she was fighting it with everything she had. The air in the room suddenly shifted. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in a single second. The golden thread between their wrists flared violently, turning a blinding, incandescent white. Granger's eyes snapped open. She let out a choked, desperate sound. No. She whispered. The magic surged. It wasn't a wave this time. It was an explosion. It hit them both with the force of a physical blow. Draco's vision whited out. He heard Granger scream. A roar, terrifying sound of absolute agony. When his vision cleared, the connection was broken. The golden thread was gone. Granger was on the floor. She had collapsed beside her chair, her knees pulled to her chest, her hands clutching her head. She was weeping. It wasn't a quiet, dignified cry. It was a broken, hysterical sobbing that tore at the silence of the room. Granger. Draco didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He kicked his chair backward. He ignored his cane entirely. He crossed the small space in a single, desperate stride, ignoring the agonizing, burning pain in his left leg as he dropped to his knees on the hard stone floor beside her. Hermione, he said urgently. She didn't respond. She just kept sobbing, rocking back and forth, completely consumed by whatever she was seeing. He didn't care about the rules. He didn't care about the boundaries they had spent years building between them. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. Instead of fighting him, she collapsed against his chest and buried her face in the curve of his neck. Her fingers twisted the dark material of his robes into tight knots as she shook violently enough to make his own body vibrate. "I've got you," Draco whispered fiercely. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against him. He rested his chin on the top of her head, burying his face in her chaotic curls. She smelled like vanilla and ozone and absolute terror. "It hurts," she sobbed, the words muffled against his skin. "Draco, it hurts so much." He froze. She had called him Draco. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a simple, devastating acknowledgement of who he was to her in whatever future she was currently living. "I know," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I know, sweetheart. Just breathe. Sweetheart." The word slipped out before he could stop it. It felt entirely natural. It felt like a word he had said 1,000 times before. "He died," she gasped out, her tears soaking his collar. "You died. I saw it. The green light. You pushed me out of the way and it hit you." Draco's heart stopped. He tightened his grip on her, holding her so tightly he was probably bruising her ribs. "I'm right here," he said, his voice a low, frantic rumble against her ear. "I'm right here, Hermione. I'm alive." "You didn't get up," she cried hysterically, clinging to him like he was a lifeline. "I was screaming for you and you didn't get up. You promised you wouldn't leave me." She wasn't in the testing room. She was trapped in a future memory. A memory of his death. The realization hit him like a bludgeon to the chest. She wasn't terrified of falling in love with him. She was terrified of losing him. The logic. The denial. The constant need for facts and rules. It wasn't because she hated him. It was because she loved him so much in that future timeline that the grief of losing him was bleeding backward into her present, shattering her mind. Draco's jaw clenched. He felt a surge of absolute, overwhelming devotion flood his veins. It was a terrifying, all-consuming feeling. A feeling that told him he would gladly burn down the entire ministry, the entire world, if it meant keeping her safe. "Focus on my voice," he ordered softly. He pressed his lips to the crown of her head. He didn't care if it was a breach of their non-existent relationship. He didn't care about anything except pulling her back to reality. "Hermione, listen to me," she sobbed, shaking her head. It was so cold. "You're right here with me," he whispered, rocking her slightly. "Feel my heartbeat. Feel it." He took one of her trembling hands and pressed it flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. "I'm alive," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. I've got you, Granger. I'm right here." She gasped, her fingers curling against his chest. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, her erratic breathing began to even out. The hysterical edge left her sobs, fading into quiet, exhausted tears. She didn't pull away. She kept her face buried in the curve of his neck. Her hand remained splayed flat over his heart, feeling the solid, rhythmic thud of his life beneath her palm. Draco held her. Sitting on the cold stone floor of the testing room, his bad leg screaming in pain, he just held her. He murmured soft, meaningless assurances against her hair while stroking her back in slow, soothing motions. He didn't know how much time passed. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been an hour. Eventually, she went completely still. The magic in the room had settled into a quiet, heavy calm. "Hermione," he said softly. She sniffled. She slowly lifted her head. Her face was streaked with tears. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked at him. Really looked at him. She didn't see the former Death Eater. She didn't see the arrogant pureblood heir. She saw the man who had just anchored her through the worst pain of her life. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice incredibly fragile. "I'm alive," he confirmed softly. She looked into his grey eyes. The air between them changed. The frantic, terrified energy vanished, replaced by something entirely different. Something soft. Something incredibly vulnerable. She looked down at his chest. At her hand, still resting over his heart. She didn't pull it away. Instead, she slowly slid her hand up, her fingers lightly brushing against his collarbone, trailing up the side of his neck until her palm cupped his jaw. Draco stopped breathing. Her skin was warm. Her touch was hesitant, but deliberate. She traced the line of his jawbone with her thumb. "I saw you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw what we become." Draco leaned into her touch. He couldn't help it. It was a pure, instinctual reaction. "I know," he murmured. "It wasn't a hallucination. No. It's real." "Yes." She let out a long, shaky breath. She looked terrified. But she also looked resolved. "Okay." She breathed. She didn't pull away from him. She simply rested her forehead against his shoulder. She closed her eyes, her fingers still resting lightly against his jaw. Draco wrapped his arms around her again, holding her close. He had no idea how they were going to fix the time-turner damage or explain this to the wizarding world. He didn't care. Burying his face in the curve of her neck, he inhaled the scent of vanilla and ozone. She was his anchor. And he was hers. She clutched his shirt tightly in her fists, holding on like he was the only solid thing left in the universe. And for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy didn't try to pull away. The first thing Hermione noticed was the smell. Antiseptic, starched linen, and a faint, familiar undertone of vanilla and ozone. She opened her eyes. The harsh, sterile white light of a St. Mungo's private ward met her gaze. She blinked against the glare, her head throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. She shifted on the mattress. The sheets rustled loudly in the quiet room. Her right hand was heavy. She looked down. Draco Malfoy was asleep in a ridiculously uncomfortable-looking wooden chair pulled flush against the side of her bed. He was leaning forward, his arms folded on the edge of her mattress, his head resting heavily on his crossed arms. His left hand was wrapped securely around her right hand. His grip was firm. Granding. Hermione didn't move. She didn't dare breathe. She studied their joined hands. The stark contrast of his pale skin against hers. The rough calluses on his long fingers, a physical reminder of how hard he had fought to anchor her during the surge. The memories of the previous night rushed back. The testing room. The blinding white flash. The horrifying, visceral vision of the green light hitting his chest. The absolute agony of thinking he was dead. She remembered collapsing on the cold stone floor. She remembered the feeling of his arms wrapping around her, hurling her against his chest, refusing to let her go. She remembered the frantic, desperate rumble of his voice in her ear. "I'm right here. I'm alive." And she remembered calling him Draco. A flush of heat crept up her neck, staining her cheeks pink. She had laid bare every single one of her defenses on the floor of that testing room. She had shown him exactly how much he meant to her in that future timeline. She looked at his face. His silver blonde hair was an absolute mess, falling across his forehead in tangled disarray. The dark circles under his eyes looked even worse in the harsh hospital lighting. He looked exhausted, completely spent. He had carried her here. His leg had been burning with pain. She knew it had been, but he had carried her out of the ministry and brought her to the healers. He had stayed all night. Hermione swallowed the sudden, tight knot in her throat. She had spent the last 2 weeks desperately trying to intellectualize the flashes. She had hidden behind massive, leather-bound tomes and ministry guidelines, terrified of what the visions meant. She had told herself it was just chronological trauma, a neurological misfire. It was a lie. It had always been a lie. She wasn't fighting the time turner. She was fighting herself. She was fighting the terrifying realization that the man sitting next to her, the arrogant, irritating, deeply damaged man who challenged her at every turn, was exactly what she wanted. The flashes weren't a curse. They were a promise. A promise of a future where she laughed in a bookshop, where she felt completely safe in the dark, where she loved someone so fiercely the thought of losing them tore her apart. She didn't want to fight it anymore. She was so tired of fighting. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her hand within his grip. She didn't pull away. She just adjusted her angle, sliding her fingers so they tangled perfectly with his. The movement was slight, but it was enough. Draco jerked awake. His grey eyes snapped open, instantly alert, instantly frantic. His head shot up. He looked wildly around the room for a fraction of a second before his gaze locked onto her face. "Granger," he rasped. His voice was rough, gravelly from sleep. He sat up straight, wincing as his stiff back protested the movement. He immediately leaned over her, his free hand flying to her wrist to press 2 fingers against a pulse point. "I'm awake," she said softly. "Are you in pain? Is your core stable?" The healers said the backlash might cause residual temporal tremors. He was firing questions like a localized bludger barrage. "Draco, stop." He froze. His fingers remained pressed against the inside of her wrist. He stared at her. "Your pulse is racing," he murmured, his brow furrowing in deep concern. He thought it was a symptom of the magical backlash. He thought she was dying again. Hermione looked at him. She looked at the frantic worry etched into every line of his pale, exhausted face. "It's not the magic, Draco," she whispered back. He stopped breathing. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy, charged with a sudden, overwhelming electric tension that had absolutely nothing to do with chronological divergence. He didn't pull his hand away from her wrist. If anything, his grip on her other hand tightened. "What did you just say?" he asked. His voice was dangerously low. "I said," Hermione repeated, her heart hammering against her ribs, "that my pulse is not racing because of the magic." Draco's eyes darkened. He leaned closer. The scent of vanilla and ozone wrapped around her, familiar and intoxicating. "Then why is it racing, Granger?" He was daring her to say it. He was daring her to admit what they both already knew. Before she could answer, the door to the ward swung open. "Miss Granger, you're finally awake." Healer Smethwick bustled into the room, a massive clipboard floating obediently behind him. He was a round, cheerful man who seemed entirely oblivious to the thick, suffocating tension he had just interrupted. Draco immediately dropped his hand from her wrist and sat back in his chair. The aristocratic mask slammed back into place over his features so fast it gave Hermione whiplash. But he didn't let go of her right hand. He kept his fingers tightly tangled with hers, hiding their joined hands beneath the edge of the crisp white blanket. "How are you feeling this morning?" Smethwick asked, pulling his wand from the pocket of his lime green robes. "I'm fine," Hermione lied smoothly. "Just a bit of a headache." Expected. The healer muttered, waving his wand in a complex spiral pattern over her chest. A series of glowing golden numbers appeared in the air. Smethwick adjusted his spectacles, peering at the numbers with a deeply satisfied expression. "Fascinating," he murmured. "What is it?" Draco asked sharply. His voice was back to the cold, impatient drawl he used on ministry officials. "Well, Mr. Malfoy, it appears the massive surge you both experienced last night acted as a sort of chronological reset." "Explain," Hermione demanded. Smethwick beamed at them. "Your magical cores. They were fighting each other for the past 2 weeks, refusing to properly tether. That's what was causing the severe temporal flashes and the violent physical backlash." The healer tapped his clipboard with his wand. "But last night, during the surge, something shifted. The resistance dropped." Smethwick looked pointedly at their arms, though he couldn't see their joined hands under the blanket. "Your cores finally harmonized. The tether is stable." Hermione felt a jolt go through her. She looked at Draco. He was watching the healer, his jaw clenched tight. "Harmonized," Draco repeated flatly. "Precisely," Smethwick said cheerfully. "You'll still need to perform the daily resonance checks for another week to ensure the tether doesn't fray, but the worst is over. The violent flashes should cease completely." The flashes were over. She wasn't going to see the future anymore. Hermione felt a sudden, inexplicable stab of loss. "I'll have a potion sent up for the headache, Miss Granger. You're free to leave whenever you feel up to it." Smethwick turned and bustled out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The silence returned. Draco didn't look at her. He focused on the blank white wall opposite the bed, his expression completely unreadable. Slowly untangling his fingers from hers, he pulled his hand back and rested it on his own thigh. The loss of contact was jarring. The skin of her hand felt suddenly, uncomfortably cold. "Well," Draco said, his voice clipped and painfully polite. "That's good news, then." He stood up. He grabbed his wooden cane from where it had been resting against the wall. "I'll let you get dressed. I'm sure you have a mountain of department paperwork to catch up on." He was retreating. The healer had told him the danger was over, and he was immediately retreating back behind his walls. He turned toward the door. "Malfoy," she said sharply. He stopped, his hand resting on the brass handle. He didn't turn around. "Yes, Granger." She threw the crisp white blanket off her legs. She swung her feet over the side of the hospital bed. Her legs were shaking slightly, but she ignored them. She stood up. "Turn around." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His mask was firmly in place. Cold. Distant. Untouchable. Hermione closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Refusing to give him a chance to speak or build the wall any higher, she grabbed the lapels of his charcoal robes and yanked him down. She kissed him. It wasn't a phantom sensation. It wasn't a flash of the future. It was real. His mouth was warm, and he tasted faintly of the mint potion the healers always gave out. For one agonizing second, he was completely stiff. Then, with a rough, desperate sound that tore from his throat, he dropped his cane. It clattered loudly against the stone floor. His arms wrapped around her waist, whirling her hard against his chest. He kissed her back with a fierce, punishing intensity. He opened his mouth over hers, his tongue tangling with hers, kissing her like he had been starving for it for weeks. Hermione tangled her hands in his messy blonde hair, holding him closer, pouring every ounce of the terrified devotion she had felt last night into the kiss. The air crackled around them. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating magic of the time-turner. It was just them. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Draco rested his forehead against hers, his chest heaving. His grey eyes were dark, completely unguarded. He reached up, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "You're sure?" he asked softly, his voice trembling slightly. Hermione looked at him. She looked at the man who had anchored her through the worst pain of her life. The man who had been terrified he was going to lose her. "I'm done fighting the anchor," she whispered. A slow, devastating smirk spread across his face. "Good," he murmured, before leaning down to kiss her again. For the first time since the blast, the heat between them belonged entirely to the present. It was raining. A steady, grey London drizzle that blurred the edges of the city and sent muggles hurrying down the pavement with their umbrellas ducked low. Draco Malfoy didn't mind the rain. He was standing near the back of a small, cramped bookshop just off Charing Cross Road. The air smelled of damp wool, old paper, and the distinct, sharp scent of Earl Grey tea that seemed to permeate every corner of the shop. He leaned heavily on his silver-handled cane, watching the woman 3 aisles over. Hermione Granger was entirely focused on a shelf of hardcovers. It had been 3 weeks since she had kissed him in that sterile St. Mungo's ward. 3 weeks of navigating a reality that still occasionally felt too good to be true. He watched her run a finger along the spines of the books. She looked better. The dark, bruised circles under her eyes were completely gone. The frantic, terrified energy that had surrounded her like a storm cloud had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, steady calm. Her curls were loose, tumbling over the shoulders of a dark green jumper that was entirely too big for her. It was his jumper. He had left it at her flat 2 nights ago. Seeing her wearing it now, the oversized sleeves pushed up past her elbows did something violent and possessive to his chest. He shifted his weight, ignoring the dull ache in his bad leg. The daily resonance checks had officially ended on Tuesday. Healer Smethwick had declared their magical cores permanently stabilized. The Time Turner incident was formally closed. There were no more flashes. No more horrifying visions of death. No more phantom sensations bleeding into the present. They were just Draco and Hermione. It was terrifying in an entirely new way. Hermione pulled a thick, heavy book from the shelf. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the table of contents. Draco pushed off the wooden bookshelf and walked over to her. The tapping of his cane was muffled by the worn carpet. He stopped right behind her. She didn't flinch. She didn't tense up or step away from his sudden proximity. She just leaned back slightly, resting her weight against his chest. It was a small, devastating gesture of absolute trust. "Find something interesting, Granger," he murmured, keeping his voice low in the quiet shop. She tilted her head back to look at him. "I think so," she said, her brown eyes sparkling with mischief. She held the book up so he could see the cover. The Physics of Time, a Beginner's Guide to Chronological Displacements. Draco scowled. "Absolutely not," he drawled. Hermione laughed softly. "It's highly rated by Muggle physicists. I just thought it might provide an interesting counter-perspective to Croker's theories. If you even think about buying a book on temporal mechanics, I am leaving you here. You wouldn't dare. Try me." He reached over her shoulder and plucked the heavy book from her hands. He shoved it unceremoniously onto the highest shelf, completely out of her reach. "Malfoy!" She protested indignantly. "You are banned from the concept of time travel," Draco stated firmly. "For the rest of your natural life." He turned to the opposite shelf. He scanned the titles, pulling down a thin, brightly colored paperback with a dragon on the cover. "Here," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Read this instead. It appears to be about a young wizard who solves mysteries. Considerably less likely to put us both in St. Mungo's." Hermione looked at the paperback. Then she looked back at him. She was trying to look annoyed. She was failing miserably. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "You're impossible," she said. "I am highly protective of my peace and quiet," he corrected smoothly. "Is that what this is? Peace and quiet?" "It's certainly quieter than listening to you recite ministry safety regulations." She rolled her eyes, but she didn't step away. Instead, she turned fully around to face him. The aisle was narrow. There was barely an inch of space between them. Draco looked down at her. The teasing edge vanished from his eyes, replaced by that heavy, magnetic heat that had been building between them for weeks. Without needing to ask permission or hesitate, he reached out. His thumb brushed a stray curl away from her cheek, lingering against the soft skin of her jawline. Hermione let out a soft, breathy laugh. It hit him like a physical blow. It was the exact larf from his very first flash. The one in the bookshop, surrounded by the smell of old paper and rain. The flash had shown him this exact moment, but experiencing it in reality was 1,000 times more potent. There was no magical tether forcing them together. There was no impending doom hanging over their heads. There was only her, choosing him. What? Hermione whispered, her smile faltering slightly as she saw the intensity in his gaze. Nothing, Draco murmured. Sliding his hand to the back of her neck, he tangled his fingers in her curls and pulled her against his chest. Then he kissed her. It wasn't desperate or frantic like their first kiss in the hospital wing. It was slow, deep, deliberate. Hermione sighed into his mouth, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his black coat. She kissed him back with a soft, entirely unhurried devotion. They were in the middle of a public bookshop. Anyone could walk down the aisle. Draco didn't care. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. He kept his eyes closed, just breathing her in. Vanilla, old paper, and rain. I love you, he murmured. The words didn't come from a phantom memory. They weren't a hallucination caused by chronological trauma. They were entirely in the present. They were entirely his own choice. Hermione opened her eyes. They were bright, shining with a sudden, overwhelming warmth. I love you too, she whispered back. Draco smiled. He didn't know what the future held. For the first time in months, he didn't care to know. The present was exactly where he wanted to be. The end.